It's an honor to be part of this important gathering parallel to COP26. And I'm grateful to the New York Times for bringing us together. I'd like to share how some companies from the Leaps by Bayer portfolio are working to tackle climate change through breakthrough innovation.
Agriculture is a major contributor to climate change and is also largely impacted by climate change. There's really this multi-scale negative impact from overuse of fertilizer. That's what we're really trying to start to reverse with Source.
Our product activates soil microbes already in the soil and helps those microbes make nutrients available to the plant in order to make it grow healthier.
It's instructive to think about the scale of this. Source can replace 30% of global nitrogen fertilizer use, and that has the climate impact of taking 200 million cars off the road. I consider that true change.
Hello, everyone. Would you come sit next to me? There we go. Thank you. That was an amazing video. Anyway, I'm Kim Severson, and I write about food for the New York Times. And welcome to everybody who's here and to the vast virtual audience. We appreciate your attention in this subject and to participating in the Times Climate Hub. So we have, we're going to have 3 of our panelists are going to be virtual, but here we have getting extra points for showing up on the couch. Is Gilbert Houngbo, who's the president of the International Fund for Agricultural Development and former Prime Minister of the Tongolese Republic, right?
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Oh, and here are our virtual panelists. I'll introduce you around and then we'll jump right in. In the middle, we have Cherrie Atilano, hello, all the way from the Philippines, the founder and CEO of AGREA, which is Agricultural Systems International, and also involved with several programs on feeding and getting food to people on the islands. And then the other woman on the panel, Dr. Alexa Vera. There we are. She's an ecologist working on the environmental impacts of agriculture for the Natural History Museum, an agroforestry expert. And then all the way on the end, Max Koeune, who is the president and CEO of McCain Foods. And pretty much all you need to know about him is his company provides more frozen French fries to the world than anyone else. So if you're eating a frozen French fry, you can ask him about it if you want it to change. So the specific impact of climate change on a multinational food company versus a coffee farmer in Uganda are very, very different. But there's no doubt that both sides are feeling climate change in a very real way. And they also share an opportunity and and a responsibility to try to slow it down or adapt to it. So we're going to examine how people on both ends of the economic spectrum are coping with climate change, what they're doing to adapt and mitigate to it, and how all of us can make sure that the transformation to a greener way of growing and processing our food happens swiftly, but most importantly, fairly. So I thought the thing to do would be to start to talk about the farmers themselves and the people who are on the ground and what the individual growers are facing and dealing with regarding climate change. So Cherrie, can we start with you? And we're going to tell us what is life like for a coconut farmer who are among the poorest farmers in the world, but a coconut farmer in the Philippines. Can you talk a little bit about the economics and the life of that farmer right now?
Thank you very much for starting it with me. So my company is called AGREA. We work with 30,000 smallholder farmers in the Philippines. Meaning of smallholder farmers, they have an average hectarage of 1 hectare to 1.5. So we work mostly with coconut farmers, and most of these coconut farmers are actually earning $60 every 45 days, where they can only harvest hard shell coconut for dried coconut meat for oil. And every time there's typhoon, and in the Philippines, we have 20 to 21 typhoons every year. So every time there's typhoon, they would lose like 5 to 6 coconut trees, and it's so hard for them to survive. So it's really tough. Most of them, it's a crime against humanity, Kim. I'm always sharing this, that the food producers are the hungriest and the poorest, especially with the effects of climate changes. So for our coconut farmers, we're really trying to provide intervention that they can survive not only every typhoon, but for the longest years until their next generation. So we're really trying to increase their productivity, layer their sources of income, include their wives, the women in the farm, to diversify their cropping system, as also in financial literacy, and more importantly, the young ones, the children of our farmers, so that they will be educated, and more importantly, they can also support the family in their growth of other crops aside from coconut farming.
And one of the ways that they're doing that to cope with the typhoons are growing roots, for example, so ginger and other roots. And can you talk about how they're intercropping that with the coconut trees, so that it maybe explain a little bit about how that actually practically works for people?
Yes, for sure. Because in the Philippines, right, as mentioned, we have so much typhoons. So what we did with our farmers, every farmer that would join the program, they actually receive a biodiversity and nutritional care package. It is composed of, some seeds to diversify, especially root crops, because if there's typhoon, at least they have root crops on the ground. And we're focusing on high value crops like ginger and turmeric, because it's really it's big in the market, especially on nutraceutical companies. And another one is we also do vegetable farming and some poultry and livestock for them. So it's part of this nutritional and biodiversity, so that when there's typhoon, they still have income from their livestock, there's income from poultry, but at the same time, they have income from root crops in 8 months to 10 months, and they can earn so much. You know what, Kim? 2 weeks ago, I was so happy because I called a farmer and congratulated him, because these farmers cried. And he said, it's my first time for 70 years farming that I received $3,000 income from 1,000 square meter of land. Never in his life. And I said, why? No one provided us this intervention that we can actually be on top of our feet again every typhoon. And that farmer was planting ginger. And right now we're planting more, because that's such an inspiring story for, coming from the ground.
Right, and so you can have a coconut farmer on the ground having roots in the ground and do intercropping. And Alexa, this is really your specialty, right? So can that idea, and I told you we're going to go down we're getting down the farm first. We'll get to policy later. Y'all have been talking about policy all week, but we're going to get down to what really happens on the farm. Alexa, tell us about intercropping, and you've studied this, right? The idea that trees in wheat fields can actually work and reduce the carbon impact of agriculture?
Yeah, that's right. So I work on agroforestry systems, which is basically just where you put trees or shrubs in amongst other crops. So in the UK, that's going to be amongst wheat or barley or whatever you happen to be growing. And so Cherrie's farmers are obviously doing the same thing. It's just about increasing the diversity in your farm. And by increasing diversity, however you do it, agroforestry, it's about bringing in trees and all the plants that live in the understory. When you increase diversity, you actually increase the jobs that nature is doing for you. And so farmers can really benefit by putting other plants in their fields. They start getting increased pollination, increased biodiversity, increased carbon storage. You get all these benefits without actually having to do very much. You plant some other plants and suddenly nature starts working for you. Whereas before, when it's just a field of wheat, the farmers are having to spend a lot of money on chemical inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, because nature has stopped doing the jobs for them that it used to do.
Right, and I think, not only the environmental damage of those inputs, but it's expensive to put, that's a big issue for farmers, is what they call the inputs, the fertilizers or pesticides that they put on plants. So if you can reduce that cost, particularly for farmers who don't have a lot of money to begin with, it's quite a thing. Alexa, is this idea, is it popular? Is it a new one? Or is it something that people are getting behind, this idea of intercropping?
So it depends where you are in the world. So in the tropics, agroforestry and intercropping is really common. And lots of people do it. And it's normally small scale, it's home gardens. Lots of coffee is produced in agroforestry systems, shade coffee. But if you go into temperate systems, it's a lot less common. So there's some in France, some in the States. It's gaining popularity as policymakers and some farmers start realizing what the huge benefits are. And the benefits kind of span lots of these different policy areas that we're trying to target. So from one land use, you can target biodiversity and you can target climate change. And biodiversity loss is as big a problem as climate change. So it's really starting to gain traction, but there still isn't the policy support. There's still a huge lack of knowledge among farmers. And so in the UK, for example, it's hardly practiced at all. I think 3-ish% of our farmland is huge in the UK. It takes up 72% of our land. And only about 3% of that is agroforestry, and that's all types of agroforestry. And so it's really not practiced very much at all. And there are quite a lot of barriers. And so we really need a huge push on kind of educating people of the benefits. Policy needs to come in here. Farmers need income support because it costs money to plant trees. So it's something that could really help meet our climate change and biodiversity targets, but it's still at very early stages in temperate regions, particularly in the UK.
I like that it's the small farmers, and certainly I've seen this myself with spice growers in India, that the small farmer is now giving good lessons for the larger agribusiness about how this should work. So speaking of large agribusiness, let's transition. Max, so you work with, I think, 3,600 small farmers or smaller operations that grow potatoes for you. Tell us some of the ways in which and that's a lot of people to impact the way we grow food. What are some of the innovative ways that your farmers are changing, and are you doing any intercropping?
Thank you, Kim. Well, yeah, we deal with 3,600 farmers around the world of all sizes, from corporate farms to smallholder farmers. And as we look at that environment and at the food system, I think it's important to stand back and look back at the broader context. Because what we have to deal with is an agricultural model and a food system that really needs a major transformation. And that's because today, as you know, the food system accounts for 1/3 of total greenhouse gas emissions. And then to feed a population of 10 billion, that's the expected number by 2050, with current practices, that would mean that greenhouse gas emissions would increase by another 87%. So clearly, agriculture and the food system in general play a major part in the urgency to decarbonize. Now, the way we're looking at this when it comes to our operation, we've seen, we heard in the videos, climate change is impacting farmers first. That's a front row seat to seeing the impact on your operations every year. We've seen it every year in the world, sometimes a few times in a row, farmers getting their crop destroyed or substantially affected because of droughts or major floodings. So the work we're doing with our farmers is really to create more resilience on their farm. What we believe will help us achieve that is to transition to regenerative agriculture. That's really about changing those agricultural practices. It's about transforming today's practices that rely mostly on chemicals to putting nature, as Alexa was saying, and biology back into the center of how we operate. So being a family business, we're owned by the McCain family. We really think that this transformation is what will take us to ensure that both our farmers and us have a business for generations to come. And for that, of course, if you deal with a corporate farm or with a smallholder farmer in India or in Colombia, the solutions are not the same. It's a different approach that we need to implement. So we announced last June that we aim to convert 100% of our farmers to regenerative agricultural practices by 2030. That's a massive transformation, and we basically have 9 crops to make it happen. That's not a lot of time. So we are doing 2 things. The first one is to establish the principles that we believe will help regenerate soil health, better manage water retention on the soil, and enhance biodiversity on the field. So we've defined 7 practices that we're working with our farmers to implement over the next 9 years. And indeed, crop diversity is an important part of that, but there's also cover crops in the winter to make sure that we use organic matter to restore soil health. And there's a number of other practices like that. The second thing we're doing is that we're investing in what we call 3 farms of the future, which we operate directly, and we implement those regenerative agricultural practices and the technology that supports it. We created the first one in our hometown in New Brunswick in Canada, and we're about to establish a second one in a developing country. And the purpose is to really demonstrate that these regenerative agricultural practices are economically viable and really impact organic matter on the soil, really help improve resilience in front of floodings because of better water management, and enhance biodiversity. Right. And so we collaborate with universities, with tech companies and other experts to constantly refine these agricultural practices and show them to our farmers so that they can adopt faster, because for a farmer, seeing is believing rather than the big concepts. It's really what happens on the ground. And that will be dependent on landscapes and will dependent on local needs of farmers of different sizes.
Great, thank you. And Gilbert, I want to talk to you because all these ideas are terrific, but they cost money, right? And I think that small-scale farmers produce, I think, 1/3 of the food for the world, but receive then less than 2% of climate finance. Can you maybe talk about the importance of financing for small-scale farmers? And like I say, these ideas are wonderful, but the reality is climate finance has to come through for them.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. First of all, thank you for having us. The challenge we have here is the fact that we know that hundreds of millions are being invested, particularly from the private sector, in mitigation. And therefore, the investment in adaptation is quite very, very, very small. In fact, out of every $18 that is invested in mitigation, we have $1 in adaptation.
And what we're talking about here is adaptation.
Exactly.
Right.
And out of even, then if you take that small amount of adaptation, it's only 1.7% of it that goes to the small-scale producers that we're talking about. So when I was listening to Max, you see, what comes to my mind, one, we just have to ramp up this type of initiative. So what we're saying is that we have to be deliberate in targeting the small-scale producers. They produce 1/3 of our food on 10% of our arable land, which is one. And secondly, see the challenge we are facing. They are the one we know. They are the one that suffer most from the climate change. And therefore, we need to bring together the whole production challenges together with the protection and making sure that we do that in a way that is respectable of the people behind that. Otherwise, we may end up also by doing very good things just to ignore the people. Particularly, and that's what our colleague from Philippines was saying at the very beginning. Out of the whole supply chain in ag, in the food systems, is estimated around only 6-7%, 6-7 cents out of every dollar that goes to those small-scale producers. So that balancing act needs to also be changed so that they can be better encouraged to adapt practices that are respectable for the environment. So targeting financing for the small-scale producers, to not only for them to change the practices, but also to be ready to adapt and to build the resilience. You know, we talk about water management. We talk about extreme weather insurance for them. We're talking about being able to access the market and the market prices for the production and encouraging the biodiversity dimension. They are ready to do it, but we just need, and when you talk about those financing, the last point I want to make here, if we can again zero in the youth, that with the same stone we can kill many birds. They will therefore be able to be better encouraged to practice agriculture, what I would call modern, sustainable agriculture that will help all of us. I was hoping, and if I can challenge Max, on the technology side, technologies really have to come to play here in trying to see how do we make technology available and affordable for those small-scale producers, so for them to be able actually to be competitive also in the market while respecting the environment.
Right. So Max, let's talk about that for 1 second. How do you, say you have a small-scale farmer, I'm sure they have a contract with you, what are you doing to actually help them afford some of this? How much should be on the private sector? And then we're going to talk a little bit about how much should be on government. But what are you doing for your small potato farmers?
Well, I can give you an example of the work we're doing in India. So we've been the first one to grow potatoes for producing French fries in India, and we're working with about 1,000 farmers in Gujarat. And those are very smallholder farmers. Typically they have 2 hectares of farm. So we've been working with them since the early 2000s in helping them improve their practices. That's day-to-day management with our field agronomy team, just sharing best practices in growing the crop, but also taking care of the land. For instance, we've helped them move from flood irrigation, which of course is a very water-intensive and resource-draining way of irrigating, to micro-irrigation, so drip irrigation. And for that, we've invested alongside them to make sure that they get access to that technology. Now, it's not high-tech, but it's a much better technology than the one that they were using before. And so it's step-by-step where we're working with them almost grower by grower and village by village to gradually improve the practices. We launched 2 years ago what we call Project UTAN with the BAAD Development Foundation to train the farmers in 4 villages in Gujarat to go to the next level of regenerative practices by improving the income of the growers, by making sure we bring more women into farming so that there's an equal sharing of activity between men and women. And we also work with them to improve their health and make sure that a healthy farmer means healthy soil, and it goes both ways. Healthy soil means healthy farmers. And that's the approach we want to implement country by country, because each country will have a different need.
Thank you. And Cherrie, I'm interested, do you think it's up to larger companies or the government to help small farmers who need that kind of aid? Do you have a sense of, is there policy at the governmental level that can help you, or is it a matter of larger companies coming in and providing such resources? Or maybe there's a completely different solution financially.
Thank you, Kim. I think it is really more of a collective action of both help. Like, for example, in our work, the big companies are actually necessary to provide technologies, but more importantly, market for the smallholder farmers. The government will engage them to provide the infrastructure, for example, farm to market road, logistics. And in the Philippines, we have 7,107 islands, and our farmers are scattered all over the Philippines. And we really need the government to help us. But more importantly, before the government helps, or even investing, our investors would help, they always make sure that you have a market. So that's where big companies are coming in. But like with Max, I want to transition, and I wish that all companies are like that, because it takes really someone to believe that smallholder farmers are the solutions of their own problem. If they are just given a chance to show it, I also want to add on empowering the youth, that was Gilbert was saying, and also empowering the women. Because when all of these stakeholders are actually working together, there are more proponents now pushing for regenerative agriculture, pushing for sustainable agriculture. More and more hands are actually encouraging the government to provide policies. So like, for example, Kim, with our work with the women, farmers in the Philippines, right now my company has been developing Women Food Producers Association. It's because we're really pushing the government to provide financing support to women. And last year, we're so lucky that our government launched the AGREA Pinay. Pinay means a Filipina, woman. And they have designed financing institution because for this Filipino women. But interestingly, we found out that most of these women, they couldn't avail financial support because the land titles are not under them. So imagine this legality is actually inhibiting them to even have access to banks or financial support because they don't have collateral. So this is now something that our company is also pushing together with some policymakers in the Philippines. How can we erase these barriers on legality? Because this is not a social and economic empowering. This is like so disempowering, right? So now we're pushing for Magna Carta for women in agriculture, that they can have access for lands. And I think like what most of the smallholder farmers are, they are recipient of agrarian reform. And when agrarian reform happened, most of the land titles were automatic named after the husband, not even to the female member of the family. And another one, as we found out, even here in the Philippines with our work, more and more women, when you're giving them the capacity to be trained, like for example, my company, we have a farm school. In every island we enter, we put up a farm school, and that farm school teaches sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture. And when we started, it was the women who got so excited. Right now, 63% of our enrollments are women. They're taking the ownership that if our husband will not follow the change in protocols and procedures, then we are the ones leading the change by training ourselves, accessing financial institution support, and more importantly, really taking ownership, especially this pandemic. They were the ones leading even the supply chain management and post-harvest losses.
Thank you. If there are questions, I'm going to go to you all in a minute so we can start a dialogue. I just had one more question for you, Alex. In terms of these questions of who should pay, I think the UK has a target of planting 30 million trees by 2050. Do I have that right? And many of those should be, I think you're arguing, have an agricultural component. Who should pay for the planting of all those trees?
Yeah, so the UK government target is 30 million trees every year. So by 2050, they want to have planted 1.2 billion trees. Now, some of those are going to have to be planted on farmland. They're going to benefit everybody. And the UK government, now that we've left the EU, we've left the Common Agricultural Policy, they're developing new agricultural policy, and they've decided that public money should be spent on public goods. So they do actually plan to pay farmers to deliver environmental benefits. And so we expect that some of the money hopefully they will include agroforestry in their new schemes. And that way, some of the money to start planting trees can come from government, because the startup costs are huge. And I think that without some incentives, farmers aren't going to do it. It's such a big investment. It's so risky for them to spend that much money planting trees. It's a system they're not familiar with, that we are going to have some kind of policy incentives to get farmers to start doing this.
Right. This is a kind of a weird question. Nobody's done research on which trees actually help certain crops grow, or is that too micro? Like an elm tree is terrific for beetroot. Nobody's to that level of this relationship
So
between trees and crops?
there are small projects looking at this, but they tend to be really small scale. There's very little research on agroforestry, not large scale research, and it's kind of repeated. And there's just a real lack of knowledge out there. And it's a really important aspect, that you have to plant the right tree in the right place. Some trees will actually inhibit crop growth.
Right.
But there are ones we know about that work, and there is advice out there. It's just difficult for farmers to access. So I think, we really need to ensure that the knowledge is there. We need more research. We need to ensure that advice is given to farmers. The Woodland Trust of the UK is giving free advice at the moment, funded by corporate money. So the whole system kind of really needs to get going to get farmers planting, because we haven't actually got time. If we want to plant 1.2 billion trees by 2050, we need to be planting them now, this autumn.
Right this very minute. We should be planting. All of you should be out in the UK planting right now. Are there questions out there right now for our wonderful panel? Yes, go ahead. Thank you. We don't have any farmers in the group, I'm betting. They're all working.
I have a question about GMO crops and what the panel's opinion is on this, because you can genetically modify plants to have higher yields, higher nutritional value, be better resistance against salinity in water or higher temperatures. Yet there seems to be quite a big public image of this, that you shouldn't grow GMO crops. But could this potentially be a solution? And what's the comments panel on this? The panel's comments on this?
Right. I think that's a great question, because GMOs are, in the States, they've become a great marketing thing. So you'll see a box of Wheaties, it'll say no GMOs, or you'll see ice cream, no GMOs. Like I don't think they're going to put GMOs in ice cream, but it looks very good on marketing. So the anti-GMO sentiment is certainly strong. And certainly it's a big argument in terms of nutrition. You can grow more calories for people with GMO crops. And on the other side, people are like, this is just really just a step above hybrid plants, which we've used all the time. So very interesting question. So I will take it to our GMOs. Is it an issue? First, let's start in the Philippines with farmers there. Are there people looking for seeds, particular kinds of seeds that might be genetically modified to against climate change? Are farmers growing those? Is it an issue in the Philippines?
Somehow it's a big issue, Kim. Actually, recently the government just launched golden rice in the Philippines. And of course, it has pros and cons, right? But the tension was massive. So many groups are really against it, because maybe of some experiences in the past that the introduction of GMO was not actually well managed. So it really destroyed the soil health. And more importantly, pest management was also a problem. So instead of farmers earning income after 7 years, it was a danger zone. Farmers were losing their income.
Right.
Their land, our soil is not responding anymore. And also the aquifer was totally damaged. So there must be proper education. If there's a GMO introduction, the farmer should have a buy-in. It should not be the government just pushing for it because it's a government program. There must be a proper consultation to farmers, and education is important.
Right. So that's the kind of genetic modification you're doing. If you're doing a genetic modification to allow you to spray a certain pesticide or prevent pests, that can have long-term damage. But maybe there is a safer genetic modification. Let's talk about potatoes. Is this, Max, what's your view on that?
We don't grow GMO potatoes anywhere in the world, or our farmers are not doing it on our behalf. On the regulatory standpoint, we know it's not accepted in most countries, so we follow the regulation on that part. Now, from the scientific side, there's work being done around the CRISPR-Cas technology, so basically gene editing within one crop, one species. There's still work being done there to prove that it's not only viable, but also can be done in a way respectful to the environment and generate the benefits that we discussed earlier in terms of resilience to climate change, etc. But the consensus is not there yet. And so from our perspective, we're looking at the scientific consensus and, even more importantly, regulation before we embark on this.
Gilbert, in your part, are genetic modifications seen as a solution to mitigating it, or is it seen as antithesis to your farmers?
No, I think that debate will remain, quite frankly, and you feel it even in the multilaterals and on the GMOs. One point, I think what Max was saying in terms of the gene editing is maybe where...
Gene editing, yeah.
Yeah, I believe the future might, and the scientific evidence might be the solution, let's hope. But the GMO per se, yes, that debate will remain there. What is also happening, I think the government need to take also final responsibility and guide, as Cherrie was saying, guide the small producers accordingly and to know what are the pros and what are the cons. And also, sometimes one has to depassionate the debate on the GMOs, everything being evidence-based on what. One point, though, for me, beyond whether it's safe or not safe, if it can be damageable to the environment, there are some studies on that. But one point that we sometimes overlook is the economic side of it.
Okay.
For me, when I see my small-scale producers, that if they have to go to GMO, every single year they need to buy
a new seed, yeah.
Yeah, the seeds, and very little, of course, control the volatility of the cost of it become an issue, although the potential is there. So that economic dimension...
Because you can't save seeds, which has been how it's been done forever and ever,
yeah.
right? And so it's more expensive,
yeah.
right, with GMOs. Is there another question? And Alex, I'm going to hit you on the GMO question later because you're the only scientist here, so we'll get to you. But yeah, let's go to you and then the woman behind you. Front row and then the woman right behind you. Thank you.
So you were talking about intercropping, which obviously adds to agriculture, which then creates more food. But food waste is a massive problem. Here in the UK, we've got things like wonky potatoes because potatoes didn't meet a government standard. Do you not think there should be more to do with this so that all food can be consumed regardless of its look or weight?
Right, so the question is about how managing food waste, or I guess it's changing people's minds about what's acceptable to eat, if you all feel that would make an impact on your markets. If we thought differently about what looks like acceptable food, and I think this is probably different in the global north than it is in the global south, certainly in terms of the kinds of perfect vegetables that a New York City shopper demands versus the reality of a delicious and ugly-looking carrot. So is waste, is that really an issue, food waste? And maybe we'll start, Max, are you growing more wonky potatoes or trying to change us from needing that perfect French fry?
So let's put it again in context. It is a huge issue. If food waste were a country, it would be the third biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, right? So tackling food waste is an integral part to tackling the climate crisis. But as you said, Kim, if you look at the world, it's very different dynamics. In the developing world, 2/3 of food waste is lost on the farms, so at the harvest time, because of storage being insufficient or insufficient harvesting techniques, etc. In the developed world, it's the loss at the end of the chain with the consumer because of the vegetables or because just managing the food not so well, meaning you buy too much and then you end up throwing out because you didn't eat all you bought. And so the answers are very different, again, area by area. In our case, we focus a lot on food waste. We've taken a commitment to have no food to landfill by 2025, and we're very much on the way there. And so we're working with our growers in the developing world to make sure that they harvest every potato they plant. And we make sure that in our operation, we reuse everything related to the potato and divert it to human or animal consumption, or reuse it to generate energy for whatever we cannot process into final product.
What do you do with all the potato peels?
It depends. Sometimes we sell it to animal feed companies. Sometimes we actually don't have loss because we sell products that have potato peel on it. So it really depends on the countries and the year, actually the month and the years. But it doesn't get lost and it doesn't go to landfill.
We have another question. Does anybody want to jump in on food waste quickly or no?
I mean, I'm so tempted on the food waste and loss. issue, which is globally 1/3 of the
One-third
global,
of the food.
Yeah, on that. And Max is right. The global north is much more at the end of the chain, where on the south is really the storage and is really the loss on the production side.
So it's production, yeah.
It's production. And we also have to see how do we balance, back to your point, how do we balance the health dimension and the environmental, i.e. the waste dimension, that expiration date. And how much of it is really lost while maybe still good,
Right.
compared to respect the national regulation. This is also part of the challenge we see on the
Right.
food waste and loss
Which
debate.
is really a change in perspective in some ways, and changing corporations around how they package and sell food. Yeah. Last call for food waste. Are we okay? We'll go to our next question.
Yeah, can you comment on the palm oil industry and its impact? The deforestation, the monoculture,
So palm oil, which is a big problem because a lot of people cook, and palm oil is an essential part of a lot of diets, you know. But the big manufacturers, so palm oil.
Yeah, and again, I really like that discussion. A lot of very sensitive issues on the on the table. Of course, if you ask, it might be good to hear from Cherrie from Philippine perspective or Indonesia and Malaysia, etc. We know there's a big debate. On the flip side, we know, for example, particularly in Europe, European and some countries in Europe are really in the process or attempted to really ban product coming from. So our position is that, you know, so we need to, maybe it's in between on that. Where that goes against, I mean, where that causes deforestation, we really need to be very clear in terms of protection of the environment and the reforestation on that. On the other hand, when it's properly managed and very controlled, you still can help some of the producers of palm oil in making it in a way that is environmentally safe, meaning that not necessarily causing deforestation and generating. I see we have a huge project in Uganda pairing their experience with Malaysia, and we have thousands of small-scale producers that have been lifted out of poverty because of that, but in very much control and working only with experts, with a scientific group, in a way that it does not cause deforestation, and also respecting some of the prescribed recommendations. So my point is that it is an issue, but let's avoid being extreme on both sides and being gradual in what we're trying to. Otherwise, sometimes I'm very worried that we might take decisions that will cause economic damage to, again, the small-scale rural producers and cause other problems.
Right, absolutely. Cherrie, do you want to add anything to that about the palm oil?
Yes, of course. I actually happened to immerse myself in Medan, North Sumatra in 2019 for like almost 2 weeks, studying about palm oil and actually, going the rainforest, and after that interviewing a lot of farmers. So there are pros and cons. Of course, when you plant palm oil, they need to be in swampy areas, and perfect is rainforest. That's why they're cutting a lot of rainforest for that one, which is actually so bad. And another one is if you plant palm oil is a very invasive crop. You cannot grow anything under palm oil. So there's actually a challenge for scientific studies on what are the type of crops that the farmers can still intercrop under the palm oil, because palm oil is not like coconut. When you plant coconut, you can plant coffee, cacao, high value products like superfoods, ginger, and turmeric. In palm oil, they don't have a high value crop yet that they discovered that they can put in there. Another one is pests and diseases. They spray so much pesticides because of the palm oil, and so many people are suffering from respiratory diseases because of this one. So of course, there's economic benefit to that, and there are several certifications that are actually coming in now, like Rainforest Alliance, they're putting in place on how our diversity in terms of our orangutans still have a place in the rainforest, enough cutting of rainforest, but at the same time, really minimize the use of synthetic chemicals and pesticides, because the farmers are also suffering from that. It's not economical for them. You know, when it's infested, all the palm oil plantations will be infested. So they don't have any choice but to get these pesticides that sometimes they don't have even proper recommendation to begin with.
Right.
So there are really like some areas, challenging areas, but more importantly, it's also an exciting areas to put on more studies and
Okay.
research.
Talking about studies and research, Alexa, are there Alex, any, do you know much about palm oil, growing it, and are there a lot of studies? Is there a safe or a good way to grow palm oil, like Gilbert was saying, that can help and be a useful crop for people?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't look at palm oil. Obviously, I know the sort of the general issues with it, but I think for me, the solution to everything we've been talking about is diversity. So, you know, the GMO question, it's not a silver bullet. There's not going to be one answer to anything. We're going to have to use all the tools in our box here. It's also about diversity in terms of the crops we grow. So can we diversify? Can we use something else instead of palm oil? It's not a great crop. You know, if we're planting these intercropping systems, farmers are going to have to find diverse markets. Diversity is a good thing. It offers resilience against, you know, floods and droughts and economic, you know, upheaval. So it's great to increase the diversity of what's being grown on our land, both at a landscape level and at a field scale. But again, some of that's going to have to be driven by markets. People are going to have to buy these more diverse crops. So there's, you know, the answer to every question and every problem here is basically diversity.
Great. We just have a minute or so left. I just want to go around and thank you all for being here. Any last things that you all want to talk about in terms of, oh, we have one question. Okay, quick one, we'll take it. Well, you have a minute, so there you go.
The population question. Population continues to expand at a rate. We need to feed them. How does feeding all these new mouths figure into this picture?
So how does feed, okay, like let's ask, how does the earth get created in a minute here? But so we have an expanding population. So when we're talking about just transformation and adaptation around climate change for small farmers, does the population growth impact this effort? Is that correct? All right, who wants to take us out with an answer to that question?
I mean, clearly we know that to be able to feed the population by 2050, we need to increase the production by 60% on that. So those are factual. We will have to increase that production. That's what is very clear. So I see it as it just increase the challenge we have. But globally, the balance, again, about the population, some countries are struggling with a depopulation. Others are struggling with maybe a too high, at least to my taste, a too high population growth. We will need to embed that in our national planning, back again to the policy and the policy issues. I am of the view that when the population is growing too fast compared to the economic growth, it's even already challenging, let alone when you bring up the environmental protection dimension and the social dimension. It makes the problem much more complex. Obviously, if you are able to deal with it now, back to my very first point, investing in the youth, that to me is the solution.
The youth. Listen, thank you all for coming. This has been a great panel, and thank you to our wonderful panelists. Thanks. Good job.
Thank you so much. Thank you.